Good morning and welcome to the Point. A year from now, we'll know who the Republican and Democrat nominees for president will be. But until then, we're going to see a lot of those who hope to become that nominee. Just last week, it was Ohio Governor John Kasich paying a visit to West Michigan. He sat down exclusively with us. There are no shortage of Republicans that are interested in running for president. And I don't think it's a particular secret that you've been thinking about this, perhaps working towards this. We have always included you in that list of people we thought would run. Now you're running. How do you go through that thought process when you know you're going to be out there with 14, 15?
Well, if there weren't 14 or 15, I probably wouldn't have run. I mean, the reason there's so many people in the race is because there's nobody who has a lead. You know, so if there were a big dog, there wouldn't be any campaign. I mean, I went through it before with George W. Bush. I mean, he was the big dog and basically wiped everybody out, you know. So the reason there's so many people in is because, you know, people think they can win. I mean, I'm surprised we don't have any milkmen or mailmen, and you know, but hey, or TV commentators or whatever. So, you know, people say, how do you stand out? I mean, my problem has never been that I don't stand out. My problem's been that I stand out sometimes too much.
What do you bring in terms of experience? You said when you announced that you're tested. I found that interesting because you have been tested at a executive level in the state of Ohio, and that's what a lot of people will think about. But I knew you when you were Congressman John Kasich, and there were some pretty trying times there. How does that all blend together? What does that make your experience like?
Well, I think my resume and my record and the results are really important. So I was chairman of the Budget Committee when we balanced the budget in Washington. It was the first time that we had since man walked on the moon, and we haven't done it since. I mean, we cut taxes, paid down debt. It was pretty remarkable. And I was a military reformer, and that was pretty tense as well. And, you know, being part of making the Pentagon, making the military stronger, but the Pentagon reformed, you know, and then being an executive. So I'm the only one that I can think of that has both, you know, balancing the budget, national security experience, and executive experience with really good results. So I think that's important. But I also think there's another side of this that one of the people who travels with me says, and that's presentation. You know, I just want people to hear me and see me and feel me, because I don't think people, first of all, they like the results. They like to see somebody achieve something, but then they want to go deeper, and they want to know, what do I think of this guy? Does he have the stuff that he takes? In terms of testing, you know, unfortunately, we had a school shooting. We thought we had Ebola. We had a water crisis. We had weather crises. I mean, the list goes on. And I think being tested means you get yourself in a position of where you deal with situations and crises in a calm, cool, deliberate manner. And that's, you don't want that to learn that when you're president. You got to know it before you get there.
When you talk about military and reforming Pentagon and doing some of those things, that becomes one of the more pressing issue of our day when you think about national security, what our military response, what our political response, all of those things. As president, where does that rank as a matter of national importance? Because some of the folks that are running say that is the most important.
Well, I mean, first of all, the most important thing is the economic situation in America and job creation. That's our greatest moral purpose. Get people work so families can be stronger. I say there's three things. Get on the road to balancing a budget so we can spur this economy and create jobs. Two, reform the Pentagon, but fund the military. You know, the Navy needs more ships. The Army needs more technology. I mean, I don't leave any of the services out, but the fact is that we do have to rebuild this military, but we can't do it without reforming the building, because we have almost 900,000 people who are in there. You know, they're bureaucrats that are tripping over one another, and nobody's held accountable. They can't make any decisions. That has to be fixed. And then finally, I believe that we have to communicate a message in this country that no one's left out, that everybody has a chance, a shot at the American dream.
You mentioned when you were talking to a group in Grand Rapids that very thing, that you felt like doing better. Not everybody does better. Making sure that everybody, you said not a handout, but that everybody participates in whatever good things that the country has to offer. How do you go about achieving that? Because we are a diverse group economically.
Yeah. Well, I think, first of all, we've done it in Ohio, and if you can do it there, you can do it, you can scale it up. And I think it is involved in terms of reforming education. I think it's involved in making sure that our friends in the minority community get a piece of the action, that they can develop entrepreneurship with a little bit of help from the federal government. I think it's also saying to poor people that we're not going to leave you behind. We're not going to pay attention to a lot of big important people and lobbyists. And for example, I created the Earned Income Tax Credit in Ohio, first time it ever happened. Why did I do that? Because I want the working poor to be able to move up. My tax plans have not only been to lower taxes for the successful, which I believe in strongly, but also to make sure there's tax relief for people who are working so they can get ahead. So I think it's things like that, and part of it is the way that a president communicates, the appearances that a president makes, and the kind of messages that a president sends, in addition to policy.
When you talk about policy, though, you were talking about things that you have done in Ohio, and some of those might not be immediately things you would expect a Republican governor to do. Expansion of Medicaid, for example, as we did here in the state of Michigan. Your education reform and the people quickly labeled Common Core. Do those things work with you or against you as you're in this cycle?
Well, I mean, if you go just with headlines, I'm not sure how they work, but I have to be out there to explain. So my position on education is real simple: high standards and local control. My position on Medicaid, where we've taken our growth rate from 9% to less than 4%, which is controlling that program, we are treating the mentally ill and the drug addicted so they're not in prison, which costs us even more money. And we're helping the working poor to get health care so they're not in the emergency room driving everybody else's bill up. So they are working for us, but we are controlling the program. And I think as president, we do need to move some of these programs out of Washington. We need to empower states to begin to solve the problems of the poor. But look, it's not just enough to give them something. My mother used to say, it's a sin not to help somebody who needs help, but it's equally a sin to continue to help somebody who needs to learn how to help themselves. That's kind of our philosophy in Ohio, and mine as just a person.
The budget is a question that you will be asked about perhaps disproportionately because of your experience, and you talked about how you did it before. When asked in a meeting in Grand Rapids, you said, look, it's going to take time. It's the one bite at a time approach. But looking at where we are with this big debt that looms out there, and that the interest on that debt may become one of our biggest line items going forward if we don't do something about it quick, as big as defense, for example. How quickly can you move versus how difficult it is to move quickly? Because in other words, if you don't stem the tide, don't you have to start paying a larger price?
Again, it's experience. Now, in Ohio, I had to get the budget balanced right away. We were $8 billion in the hole, and now we're $2 billion in the black, which is great. But we had that constitutional requirement. In Washington, if we can get on the road and have a credible plan that can pass, this economy will start humming again. And as the economy hums and as there's more economic growth, that coupled with the changes that you make, some of it involves shifting power out of Washington back to where we live. Some of it is privatization. Some of it will be eliminating programs, and then an innovative approach to entitlements. You're not going to get there overnight. It probably wouldn't be possible, or it might even be too disruptive. But as long as you could get along that, and if people say, oh yeah, politicians have said it over and over again, I've done it. So when I say it, it's one thing to have a theory about it, it's another thing to have the experience. So I'm pretty confident that, but we got to heal these divisions between the parties and internally inside. There are Republicans, if you had a balanced budget plan, they'd vote against it because they'd say it's not fast enough. Well, you got to get the votes to get things done. And as long as we move in the right direction, we'll be fine. A lot of work on that front, however, getting people together.
As I always encourage all candidates, whenever you're here, I would be delighted to have you come back because I like to talk policy particularly, but I can't let you go without this final question, and that's about politics. We started at the beginning, and you said one of the reasons you got in is because there's not the big kid on the block, and that makes some political sense.
The big dog.
On the other side of that ledger, however, it is sometimes hard to get your voice heard. For example, I don't know what the Fox debate in Cleveland looks like in a couple of weeks, but they went to the top 10 in the average of polls. I don't know if you end up in that debate down there. You may have a better idea of that than I. Is that kind of stuff important now, or is the stuff that you're doing about going around?
I think what I'm doing now is more important, but here's what's interesting to note. It has come out here over the course of the last few days that the candidate that Hillary Clinton's organization is most worried about is John Kasich. That'd be me. okay? And it's really interesting, isn't it? So in politics, you just keep at it, You deal with each of the hands you're dealt, you play them as best you can, and just keep going. And as long as I can raise the money and we don't go in debt, I'm going to be out here fighting. And as Arnold says in some of his movies, I'll say it in regard to Michigan, I'll be back.
Later this week, the first big debate for the Republican candidates is in Cleveland. Of course, we'll be talking about that right here on 24 Hour News 8 and next Sunday morning on To The Point. And we're back in just a minute. Welcome back to The Point. In the Michigan State Senate this week, we visited with the youngest member, a Democrat from the southeast side of the state, with an interesting background and take on his role in lawmaking. Senator, let's start with a bit of an introduction because for many of my viewers, they've not met you. Your district is Dearborn Heights, in an area that runs down and kind of makes an odd shape, which we'll get back to in a minute.
Sure, yeah.
But tell me about how you got to be here and a little bit about your personal background.
Yeah, so I guess it probably goes back to when I was in high school and loved student council, loved student government, wanted to get involved. Did that at the high school level, went off to college, and you know, in 2006, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were really hot and heavy, and so I kind of felt like it was my obligation at that time to do my part to serve our country. And so I went into the Marine Corps, served from 2006 until 2010, did 2 tours overseas in Iraq. And when I came back, got back into university to finish up my studies, and actually ran for state representative when I was a senior in college. And so it timed out kind of nicely where I got elected in November of 2012, graduated in December 2012, and got sworn into office in January 2013. So it was kind of a whirlwind back then. And after one term in the House of Representatives, there was an opening here in the Michigan Senate. And so took the chance and threw my name in the hat, as they say, and here we are.
That makes you the youngest member of the state Senate, I assume?
Yeah, right now, 28 years old. I turn 29 next month. And so youngest senator right now in Michigan, and very proud of the fact that the first Iraq War veteran to get elected to the House and the Senate here in the state.
Well, that's an interesting combination of first, if you will, because you do represent a younger generation than many of your colleagues in the Senate, and having the most recent military experience there. What does that do to your perspective, understanding the fact that you're serving in the minority, or as one of your colleagues told me, the vast minority,
right.
With Republicans holding kind of an unprecedented number of seats over there. But how does that shape your perception as you go into that chamber?
Yeah, well, definitely, the military background, brings with it a certain sense of discipline and a certain way to analytically approach the problems that we have here in the state of Michigan. Having served in that capacity and accepting the fact that the military is full of a lot of conservative folks who don't necessarily think the way I do, it allows me to really navigate that space to try and bring both parties together to try and come to a consensus on the issue. And because of that military background, it's put me in a unique position to try and advocate for veterans affairs here in the state of Michigan. And my belief is to do so with a certain level of credibility, having just come out of that space. And then as a young person, obviously, we tend to be a tad bit more aggressive, outside the box thinkers, if you will. And so I'm less interested in beating the drum, the next 4, hopefully 8 years up here. I much rather talk about solutions. And if that involves and requires bringing together both sides of the aisle, that's something that I want to be a part of.
How have you found that process? I mean, you obviously had experience in the House, so you served with some of these folks. But how does that impact, and how have you found the impact to be in working with the majority party? Because there are guys like me that make too much of the partisan squabbles that are sometimes highlighted over some really big issues.
Right.
But that's not necessarily every day.
No, and I try to highlight for the folks back home, 95% of the things that we do up here, it's unanimous. We all agree upon that. And so I try not to let that 5% of the really emotionally charged, divisive issues, I try not to let that ruin the way that I would approach any relationship with anybody up here. And for me, it's about being genuine. It's about being forthcoming about your intentions and what your priorities are with members on both sides of the aisle. And to my experience, particularly within the veteran space, I think that I found a tremendous amount of willingness from the majority party here in Michigan to work together to try and advance the ball, because the reality is, particularly with the veteran space, we're so great as politicians to talk about how much we love the veterans and what we want to do to help the veterans. And then we get up to that Capitol building over there and we don't know what to do. And so I've tried to be very honest and very aggressive in the fact that I don't think we're doing a good enough job. I think that we're great at patting ourselves on the back, but we're not great at delivering. And so if folks want to have a serious conversation about this is something that makes us look good, but it doesn't really do anything, versus this is substantive and it's going to make a serious change in the lives of our veterans, that's the direction that I want to move the conversation in.
At one point, the state of Michigan was number 53 out of 50 states in the ability to serve veterans. I think that has improved marginally, perhaps, but that is a nonpartisan issue, because certainly
Right.
I know one of your Republican colleagues over in the House, Holly Hughes, has worked on that for a number of years, but you are on the verge of getting something important done for veterans in terms of service dogs. Explain to me what this is, because for people who aren't familiar and don't know, this can have a big impact on a returning service member's life.
A huge impact. You know, for so many of our veterans coming home from Iraq and Afghanistan right now, and certainly the veterans that have come home from World War II, Vietnam, Gulf War, Korea, they bring back with them what I commonly refer to as the invisible wounds of war. You know, it's easy to identify somebody who might have lost a limb or somebody who might have been shot. It's harder to see that veteran who suffers from post-traumatic stress or a traumatic brain injury. And these are the injuries that more and more of our veterans are coming home with today from Iraq. And for a lot of those veterans, they find comfort and they find solace in a service animal, someone who allows them to go about their daily lives, to make a healthy transition and reintegration home. And that needs to be the priority. The problem that we've had for a number of instances, not just here in Michigan, but across the country, is the veterans are coming home, they've got the service dog, they're going into a place of business, and folks are looking at them and saying, well, you've got all your limbs, you can hear, you can see, you're not disabled, you don't need that service dog, you must be faking it, so please escort yourself out of the premise. And this was a great time to highlight again my personal belief of, well, I could sit here and I can try and beat up these businesses and I can try and, toe the party line, but that's not going to do anything to help the veterans. I don't think that individuals were malicious with what they were trying to do here, but we needed to have some level of protection for those veterans, and we needed to have some level of education for the business community here in Michigan. And so I worked with Representative Tom Barrett, Senator Margaret O'Brien, Representative David Rutledge, put together a 4-bill package that would protect the veterans and the service dogs that serve them. Both sets of bills have passed out of their respective chambers, and I'm very hopeful that they're going to be passed here by the end of the summer.
What is it like 6 months into your first term here in the Senate to actually see something that you believe in, something that you champion, get passed? Because again, you're working in the minority,
right,
and it isn't a given that you're going to get something passed in your first year.
Sure. I think about the athletes who joke about, they work 20 years to become an overnight success. This has had a tremendous amount of success here in the Senate the first couple months, but it's because we've been doing 2 years of work on the back end to make sure that it gets done right. But again, when the issues are right and when you're coming at it from a genuine place, I think the majority sees that and they respect that and they want to be a part of that success. And my willingness and the chair's willingness to demonstrate that veterans issues cannot be partisan here in the state. We all have an obligation to make sure that we're taking care of these veterans when they come home and once they're making that transition back to Michigan. And so I, for one, I appreciate greatly the majority's willingness to work in collaboration with one another.
You're working on another issue that I would consider nonpartisan, and I consider it that way for a couple of reasons. One is because I suspect that there are both Republicans and Democrats that would identify with the need to make the change that you would like to make. And I would also suggest that there are Republicans and Democrats that want to leave it just the way it is,
sure,
because it plays into the hands of the party that's in power. And of course, even if you aren't in power now, you hope to be later. So let's talk about redistricting. In fact, this is a similar conversation that we had with Representative Hoadley just last week on this show. But you would like to see the way we draw lines change.
Absolutely. And Representative Hoadley has been a great champion for this issue. Down in my neck of the woods, Representative Jeremy Moss from Southfield has also been a great champion. The fact of the matter is right now, politicians, once every 10 years, they pick their voters. They pick who's going to be voting for them. The voters don't get to pick us. And so you look at districts like mine, for example, 82% Democratic base. The decision is made in the primary. There's no competitiveness across the board. And so when you look at, say, the Michigan House of Representatives, 110 representatives here in the state of Michigan, only 10 of those seats in any given year are competitive or up for a hotly contested race. And so what we need to do is take that redistricting process out of the hands of politicians, return it to the people themselves. Let the people pick their representatives, because again, as you mentioned, right now we are the ones making the decision based upon what we can do to keep ourselves in office. And that's not right in my opinion. And so I'm very excited to see sort of the groundswell of support that we're seeing here in the state about taking this redistricting process out of the hands of politicians and returning it to the people.
And you would put a commission in place, I assume?
Absolutely. And when you look at states like California and Arizona, you see some phenomenal examples of how you can get that commission to work in a nonpartisan way, in a way that draws lines to be compact and contiguous and to represent like interests of the community. And so, again, when you look at a district, say Representative Brinks out in Grand Rapids, and you start in the bottom of her district and you drive due north, and you end up going in and out of her district 9, 10, 11 different times. That's not right. When you've got congressional districts that snake their way through multiple different communities just to draw a certain number of Democrats or a certain number of Republicans into the process, that's not fair. And we need to be honest with ourselves, Rick, that Republicans do it just as much as Democrats do it. I'm saying that both parties need to be taken out of the process, and the people themselves need to be able to make decisions.
Is there, you talked about a groundswell, is there a sense that this is something that has reached a critical mass and that you can start to get buy-in from the majority?
So that's a good question. What's interesting to me is now that the Supreme Court has ruled on this issue, it certainly opens the doors for both political parties to come to the table and have this conversation. And the same way that I like to approach veterans issues, I like to approach a nonpartisan issue like redistricting, and to have Democrats and Republicans come together to demonstrate that leadership, to drive that conversation forward. Now, if that's not going to happen, we've heard of a number of organizations across the state, the League of Women Voters is one of them, who might be able to pick up that ball and run with it to make sure that this gets put on the ballot, and the voters here in Michigan have the opportunity to make that decision.
Yeah, 2016 could have a lot of ballot initiatives, and we may be back to talk to you about them. But in the final moments we have, I want to talk to you about that one issue that has been batted around in Lansing for a couple of years, and certainly in the last 8 months. Are you hearing that there is anything closer to a decision about roads that's going to be able to get passed by both chambers?
What I'm hearing coming out of the House of Representatives is certainly disheartening. I was opposed to the plan that we passed here in the Senate, and I'll tell you why very briefly. My experience with the voters is that if you go to them and say, I need your support on a millage or a tax or whatever it may be, when you're sincere and you say that I need it for this purpose and I apply it to that purpose, the voters support it. They understand the value and the benefit. What we're doing with the plan right now, the 15 cents increase, 8 cents of that goes to help roads. 7 cents of that goes into this mysterious lockbox that can't be opened by legislators unless they pass a secretive little resolution. And so we're being disingenuous from the get-go. How could we ever expect to pull together both sides of the aisle when the very infrastructure that we are building from is flawed? And so for me, we have to come back to the table on this. We can't continue to kick the can down the road. And the excuses that the parties may point their fingers at one another, that just doesn't fly anymore. We have Republican governor, Republican House, Republican Senate, Republican Secretary of State, Republican Attorney General. Folks can't point fingers at one another to say that they're the reason things aren't getting done. It's one-party rule here in Michigan. Anything that could be done should be done. And there's really no excuses for otherwise.
Our thanks to Senator Knezek for talking with us this week, and we're back with more To the Point in just a moment. As I mentioned earlier, the first debate for the Republican presidential candidates is this week in Cleveland, but you'll be seeing a lot of circulation of candidates in our area too. Coming to Mackinac Island this fall, a lot of Republican candidates will show up. We will too, and we'll bring it to you every Sunday morning right here, To the Point.